Hi, hi everyone, and welcome to the last, but I'm sure greatly anticipated session on the production track today. My name is Elena. I'm the founder of Achievers Hub, and I'm an advisor at Games Gathering. This is a fireside chat, though we don't have any fireplace this time, so we have to use a little bit of imagination. And today we have a very special guest, a legendary game designer straight from California, Josh Sawyer. Hi, Josh. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm good. What time is it now in California?
It is 9 a.m.
Thank you for joining us so early in the morning.
No problem. I'm normally up. I'm normally up by now, so it's not a
Yeah,
problem.
that's good. Because I'm a night owl, so it would be very early for me. You're my hero already. And I'm sure you're a hero of all of us, not only because of this. Josh Sawyer is a studio design director at Obsidian Entertainment, known for his work as project director and lead designer at Pillars of Eternity and game director of Pillars of Eternity 2. He also worked on Icewind, Alpha Protocol, Neverwinter Nights 2, and many other projects. A few years ago, I was preparing a discussion panel about the differences between the Russian-speaking game development and the game development industry in the other parts of the world. And I sent a questionnaire to my friends from different countries, and you filled in this questionnaire too. And there was a question, when you were a kid, did you dream about becoming a game developer? And your answer was yes. Can you tell us more about it? Maybe you remember some special moment when this thought came to your mind. Maybe there were some particular games that inspired you the most.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was when I was a child, like not like a young kid. When I was a young kid, I loved playing games. I loved playing video games, and I eventually got into tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that, I played Bard's Tale, fantasy, wizardry, like a lot of the really early role-playing games that were on IBM PC and Commodore 64. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, I started playing Pool of Radiance, Darklands, the whole Gold Box series of games. And I think sometime around when I was in high school, I was playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, second edition Dungeons and Dragons.
Makes sense.
And I remember we were kind of arguing about, or not arguing, but like my players and I were talking about the rules and that they were not good. There was something about I don't even remember what the rules were, but they were like, this is not very good. I'm like, let's just change it. And I didn't, I guess I never really thought, I didn't think initially that you had to be a professional game designer to do game design, or I guess you call it tabletop modding or hacking, hacking Dungeons and Dragons. But I was like, oh, I'm just going to start changing a lot of these rules. So then I just started changing more and more rules. And eventually I decided I'm going to make my own game system and I'm going to make my own setting just for me and my friends. And then when I was in college, I did that more, and I was like making multiple rule systems. There was a point in college where I was playing in 4 tabletop games a week. I was running 2 games and I was playing in 2 other games, and I was failing my classes. But I was doing it so much. And then toward the end of college, I went to school initially for voice, for singing.
Wow.
And then I that did not work out because being a musician at the conservatory that I went to was a lot of work and I was very lazy. And then I switched over to a history degree, which was also a lot of work, but not as much work. But then I was graduating with a major in history and a minor in theater. And I'm like, I don't really know what I'm going to do. And I had also taught myself web design because this was back in the mid 90s. And so I had taught myself HTML.
Wow.
I taught myself how to use Photoshop, and I taught myself Flash, which was Macromedia Flash 3.0 at that time.
Oh,
and I had wound up getting some jobs doing freelance web design, and I applied for a webmaster position at Black Isle Studios, which was in Irvine, California at the time. And I got the job, and it was in part because I knew Flash. I was 3 of 59 applicants that knew Flash. and it was for they said it was for a Dungeons and Dragons based property. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I got hired, and it was the Planescape Torment team. So I wound up going to California out of college, even though I had no formal education in web design, to be a website designer. And then within about 9 months, I switched over to being a junior designer on Icewind Dale. So I guess that was a long way of saying I just started designing games on my own because I wanted to, and it didn't seem like a thing that you needed anything special to do.
Yeah,
Like I was
but
just like, I'm just going to do it. And then at some point I'm like, oh, I could actually apply for a job with a company and maybe I could make money doing it.
well, and you definitely did. It
Yeah.
turned out to be true.
Yeah.
Okay, so your first big project was Icewind Dale 2 back in 1999. Most of us didn't even think about our professional career back then. So, from your perspective, what are the main differences between developing a game in late 90s and developing a game now? And what remains the same over these years?
There's a lot of stuff. I mean, that was actually Icewind Dale 1. But the team sizes were much smaller. So of course, I want to say the Icewind Dale 1 team was, like 20, maybe 30 people tops. I mean, now it's not uncommon for, even at Obsidian, which is not a huge studio, for our teams to be like 80 to 100 people. And even that is kind of undersized at certain points. So much smaller team sizes. People tended to be less specialized, I think. The process of making art was more time consuming, but it was also simpler in a lot of ways. So you would still have environment artists, but you wouldn't have people that are hyper specialized on like sub elements of modeling or texturing or whatever, material development. Designers also were far less specialized. So when I worked on Icewind Dale 1, I did all of the paper design, the layout, the creature design, encounter setup. I designed all the items in my area. I wrote all the dialogues. I set up all the quests. That was something that like a designer would just do for all their areas. And while that's not impossible to do now, especially for the type of RPGs that we make now, or companies like BioWare or CDPR or Bethesda make, that's usually too much to ask, or it takes a long time for a single designer to do that. So I think over time, things have become more specialized. Also, when I got into the industry, at least with role-playing games at Black Isle, it was very much focused on PC development. And there wasn't a lot of crossover with console. And now that is not only much more common, but it's much easier. Like it's not uncommon or difficult at all to hop over multiple platforms. And obviously there's the design element that you have to think of, like controller versus mouse and all these other different things. But back then it was much more segregated. And now it's just kind of like, it's I don't want to say taken for granted, because there are still certain limitations, but it's not uncommon to have cross-platform development all the time.
Yeah, and what is still the same?
I would say the overall processes are still the same. There's more discipline, I think, in the industry, but there's still that idea of talking about goals, talking about ideas, writing things down on paper, trying to iterate through it in the sort of simplest form that you can to find some kernel of fun. There's always, I think, this wrestling of your time and your budget and sort of what your goals are. So you're always going to be wrestling with the creative process itself. I don't think that's ever going to change. You always have time and money to deal with. You always have your tech to deal with. If you have a publisher, you always have their expectations to deal with. You're always going to have to think about, like whether it's hardware requirements, console requirements. Like for anyone who's done console development, things like TCR, TRCs, which are technical compliance requirements. Like you can't just kind of do whatever. Like the console manufacturers want you to follow certain guidelines. And while the guidelines change, that's still always going to be a process. Localization is more or less always the same. Like there's a larger market. I think we localize into more languages now. Deadfire, Pillars of
Yeah.
Eternity 2 shipped on 10 language SKUs, which is crazy. But the process is still the same. Like, we still sort of like put all of our strings into a database and send them off. And so I would say the overall process is still the same sort of creatively. It's just there's more people and it's more complicated, but making games is still largely the same. And I would like to believe that there's a little more discipline to it because when we started, it was just a bunch of, well, and that's another thing that's changed is when we started, it was a bunch of dudes. I mean, there was not a single female game developer at Black Isle. So whereas now there is better representation, but
Definitely.
yeah, so there you go.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And following your career, in 2005, you accepted a position at Obsidian Entertainment. Your first position was lead designer at Neverwinter Nights, right? Neverwinter Nights 2, correct?
Sorta. I was a senior designer on that project, and then I temporarily went over to another project, and then I took over as the lead at the end of development. But yeah, essentially.
Okay, yeah. At Obsidian, you worked on Neverwinter Nights 2, on Alpha Protocol, Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, of course. And I know that's a tricky question, and nobody really likes it usually, but which game is your favorite and why?
I would say that I think just because of the opportunity, it would probably be Fallout New Vegas. Because when I came to Black Isle Studios, so that was 1999 when I went to Black Isle. That was only a year after Fallout 2 had come out, right? That was the end of 1998. So I really wanted to work on Fallout 3. That was like my dream when I went there. Like working on a D&D game because I had played so much Dungeons and Dragons was fantastic. I was like, okay, so I did that. Now let me work on a Fallout game. And we kind of did. We started it at Black Isle, and then Black Isle shut down. That was the Van Buren project. And Interplay sold the rights of Fallout to Bethesda. So I was like, well, I guess I'm never going to get to work on a Fallout game. And then when, Fergus Urquhart, who's our CEO, or now studio head at Obsidian, he was talking to Bethesda and that opportunity came up. And that was incredible. Like I don't think any of us at the studio thought that we would get a chance to work on Fallout. And a lot of the people at Obsidian back then and still now are former Black Isle people. So it was a really great opportunity. It was a crazy development cycle because it was just 18 months, which was way too fast. But I think we made something pretty cool. And even though it was not super well received when it first released, over time, I think people have really appreciated it. And so that's great. The ability to actually work on something that you never thought that you thought you were going to be able to, then you lost the opportunity, then you got the opportunity back. And then in the end, people actually really liked it. That was good.
Yeah, that's quite an emotional roller coaster.
Yeah.
No wonder that you remember this one. Okay, so but you also worked on some big projects that were cancelled. Of course, that's an extremely tough situation for any game developer. And first, do you think that these projects were cancelled for good? And also, maybe you can advise something to a development studio on how to deal with such situations when your game is cancelled by a publisher or investor.
Yeah. Do I think that the projects were canceled for good reason, or do I think they were canceled forever?
For good reason.
For good reason. Okay. It depends from project to project. The first big cancellation I had to deal with was at Black Isle. I worked on a game called The Black Hound, and that was a Dungeons and Dragons game using our own engine. And I was the lead designer, and I wrote way too much documentation and all this stuff. And we worked on it for, I want to say 2.5 years in pre-production, which is a long time in pre-production. And then it got canceled because Interplay lost the rights to make D&D games other than Dark Alliance games. And that sucked. Like, that was awful. And that was not a good reason. It wasn't because the game was not going super quickly, but by Interplay or Black Isle standards, it wasn't especially bad in terms of development, but it was really just purely canceled because they lost the license. And it was like, well, this is a Forgotten Realms D&D game. There's no real way around that at the time. And at the time, people couldn't really do the open source licensing of, or at least we didn't think we could. And so we had to cancel it, and that felt really bad. And then Fallout was canceled because Interplay wanted to just shut down Black Isle, more or less. So that didn't feel good. Games like Aliens, Aliens, I was the lead designer on, but not the director. Obsidian didn't have directors until the end of Aliens because it was not going very well. And then I took over as the director, and then it was canceled, and I was bummed, but I was like, yeah, like, I understand why you canceled this project. Like, it was not going well. So, I mean, sometimes projects feel like they're canceled for good reasons. Sometimes they feel like it's a bunch of BS. I think early on, because I put so much of myself into every game that I made, and I was so emotionally attached to them, it was harder at the beginning. And it's hard to not get really despondent, because I think I've had like 6 projects canceled. Now, that's over 21 years. So, and I know people that they get into the industry for years and it's just canceled. They get games canceled for 5 or 6 years and they've never shipped anything, which is extremely demoralizing. So it's hard not to despair and kind of feel like everything can be taken away at a moment's notice. But I think I've reached a point now where I understand that I'm being paid as an employee by someone else. That person is receiving money from someone else. At any point in time, the money could stop, which is not a great thing to think about, but it's something that's good to understand, because that's just kind of the reality of the world. And it doesn't mean you need to despair, but you need to sort of keep a healthy understanding of like, we're all in this capitalist thing together. So it can happen. And my sort of attitude is I always believe that a game can be canceled until it is actually in people's hands. I know a producer who told me that he knows of a game that went gold. It actually went gold and never shipped, because this was back in the early 2000s. The publisher decided that the cost of goods to replicate the discs, print the manuals, put them in a box, and ship them was not worth the payback they would get from selling the game. So that's how late in development, technically, a game can be canceled.
Yeah.
So it's not a great thing to think about. And now we have digital distribution, so stuff like that is not really as big of an issue. But always remembering, like, as passionate as you are about the games that you're working on, unless you're just doing it on your own time completely and your own money completely, remember that you're part of a company that is being paid by other companies, which is being, and stuff can go wrong, and you kind of have to prepare yourself for that. And also, unless the contract terms that you have are extremely favorable, in a lot of cases, the things you're working on don't belong to you. Like, legally, they don't belong to you.
Yeah.
So, I've never, for example, when I worked on Pillars of Eternity, like, I created the majority of the setting and I directed the first 2 games, and but they're not mine. And I've never had the attitude that they are mine. I made them for Obsidian, and I'm glad that I have like a position in the company where I am a voice of some authority on it, but it doesn't belong to me.
Yeah.
And so having that sort of healthy level of, and if I leave Obsidian or I get fired or something, that's Pillars of Eternity is gone for me. It's somebody else's. So I know that sounds tough, but that's kind of some of the stuff that you have to think about to keep a healthy level of understanding and distance between yourself and your passion and the things that you're working on.
Yeah, that's a good advice, because a lot of developers get really emotionally attached to their games and they feel like these games are the part of themselves. So sometimes if your game is canceled, it doesn't mean that there is something wrong with you or with your studio.
Yeah, and it's like I said, it's a hard balance, because and I've gone through periods of time where I feel very despondent, like where I'm just like, I don't want to make games anymore. I want to leave the game industry. This sucks. So I mean, it happens. Like no one wants to go through that. If it happens a bunch of times, or like especially a bunch of times in a row, it doesn't feel good. And you can always think about what other things could I do that where I'm not going to be so vulnerable to like damage if things don't go my way. But now I think, because I've been doing this for a long time, I feel like I've reached a point where I can still be passionate and excited about what I do, but recognize that it's a job and that there's a little bit of separation there. It's a hard balance. Okay. It's a hard balance to find, but yeah.
By the way, if you decided to leave the games industry, did you have any thoughts on what industry could it be?
Well, I mean, yeah, the only thing that really appeals to me, and I'm sure it would be awful, would be being a bicycle frame builder. So I'm really into bicycles, and I build bikes from the frame up, and I've done bicycle frame building itself. So actually building the frame out of steel, brazing it. And I know a bit about it, and I know that it's very popular now. I'm sure it would be awful, and I don't even know if I'd be any good at it, but that's probably the only thing that I've thought of, because it's like manual labor. It's very focused. But it's artistic. So yeah, bicycle frame building.
Okay, but we're lucky that you didn't leave us and you stayed in the industry. Okay, so let's get back to the timeline. And at the timeline, we are now around 2020, when Obsidian was on the edge of financial disaster, but there was a famous Kickstarter campaign when Pillars of Eternity met its goal of $1.1 million in like 27 hours, right?
Yeah.
And I know that Pillars of Eternity 2 was also crowdfunded, and you was one of the enthusiasts of going to Kickstarter and trying this way. What do you think were the reasons for such success, and would it be possible to recreate it now in a modern world?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of reasons for the success, especially of the early Kickstarter titles. One was the novelty of it. At that time, there were still not that many games that had been crowdfunded. I think Double Fine Adventure maybe was the first one, and then I think Wasteland 2 maybe right after that. And so it was still very novel to people, the idea of crowdfunding something at that scale. And actually, we had been talking, I think Nathaniel Chapman, who's a good friend of mine and was a designer at Obsidian, he said he had the idea of years earlier. He's like, could we crowdfund a small game? Like, how would that even work? And so people were talking about that for years. And then when it finally happened, that's when at Obsidian, I and a few other people were like, we really got to do this. So I think and for me, I said, like, this is a time thing. Like, if we don't present a game like this, there are other RPG developers that will present a game like this. And then it will be hard. So the novelty of it, the newness of it, I think had a big impact. I do think that at that time, publishers were extremely, because this was still like digital distribution was taking off, but it wasn't quite as crazy as it is now. And broadband penetration was not quite as crazy as it is now. So publishers still did not want to make small games. They really had very little, like the only games that they saw worth making that were small were like Xbox arcade games. That was really sort of the mentality of publishers. They wanted to make big AAA games. That's it. So games like Double Fine Adventure or Pillars 1 or Wasteland 2 or all those other early games, they were clearly small scale games that publishers were absolutely not interested in making. And that's not just something we were saying. Like Fergus would talk to our CEO, would talk to people, publishers, and they're just like, no, like we want to make a huge epic thing that's 3D, first person, whatever, which is fine. That's nothing against those games, but like we're also like, we know that there's an audience for these smaller games. And now broadband penetration is much better. not necessarily in the US, but around the world. And
Yeah.
digital distribution is kind of just the way, like buying games in stores is not, at least in the US, is not a really big thing anymore. So the idea of having lots of smaller or mid-sized games that are digitally distributed, that's not weird at all. I think that people can still find, and they still do find success on Kickstarter. It's a lot harder to get attention. That's the hard thing. When Pillars or Project Eternity, when we announced that, there were very few games that were happening on Kickstarter. So, and it was a big deal. And so the press really fed that engine, which even with Pillars 2, there was much less attention. Pillars 1 did very well critically and commercially, but even by the time Deadfire was crowdfunded, like, you know, we made almost as much money, but there was, when we tracked the press attention, attention was just divided across so many more games. There are so many games coming out now, which is a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's hard to get attention for funding. It's hard to get attention for getting articles even written or interviews written.
Yeah.
And then once those articles get written and go out there, getting the attention of the audience that has so much content to look through, that's really difficult. So I do think that if you're going to try to do something through crowdfunding, and this maybe is just true of making a game, like obviously it has to be something that you're excited and passionate about, because if you're not genuinely interested in it, it's going to show and people are not going to, they're not going to be into it. But if you can find something that is really unique, which I know is easier said than done, but if you find something that's really unique and really like novel, something that the public and the press are really going to find interesting and intriguing, that is probably the best way. Like Pillars of Eternity as a setting is pretty generic, at least with the first game. Like it's very standard fantasy. And like, I know that I'm not like, I did it intentionally, but if I were to try to pitch a crowdfunded fantasy setting now, I would not try to do Pillars of Eternity because it's just so ordinary in a lot of ways. Like Deadfire was a fairly big departure in a lot of ways, but that's the sort of thing, is like, now that you have the Divinities and the Pillars and all these other games, Pathfinder, Kingmaker, like that aesthetic and that idea of the game is not very unique. So who cares, kind of? Like, is the press going to care? Is the public really going to care? So if you want to crowdfund something, try to crowdfund something that's very, very unique. I would say that would be, it's not like I've tried it because we just did Pillars and Deadfire, which are pretty safe in a lot of ways. But that's my opinion, just based on the fact that there's so much crowdfunding, there's so many games being made. It's just very hard to get attention. So find a way to get that attention.
Okay, and from your experience, what is more tough, to feel the pressure from the publisher or to feel the pressure from the audience that gives you money?
The audience, easily. I don't care about the publisher. Like, I mean, I really don't. Like, I mean, if the publisher gives critical feedback that I think is valid, sure, but like, who cares? Like, it's ultimately it's about how are the people who are going to really play it feel about it. If the publisher comes to me with concerns that I feel reflect the concerns of the audience, cool, then that's like a conversation to have, because it's ultimately about the same thing. It's about how are people going to feel about this when they play it. If it's just kind of abstract stuff where the publisher is like, we don't like this, I don't care. Like, I don't, who gives a shit? Like, unless the publisher themselves is planning on buying like 2 million copies of the game, it doesn't matter. Like, it's always about the audience at the end of things. Now,
yeah, but the publisher can shut down the game.
They can. I mean, like, I only care about their opinion insofar as they will pay us money. But like, I don't, other than that, like, I don't feel like their feedback is inherently more valid or their criticisms are more valid than the players. I always am going to think that the audience is going to give better feedback, not necessarily that clearly or that fairly or that nicely, but the audience, if the audience doesn't like it, you're going to know. If the audience likes it, you're going to know.
Yeah.
Whereas with the publisher, I feel like publishers often, it feels very abstract and it feels very like second guessy and kind of like, well, I don't think, or I feel this, which is not really that actionable. yeah, publishers pay you money, and you have to make sure that you're not like actively pissing them off. But what I don't think is that if you have a situation where the audience is clearly saying one thing and the publisher is saying no, actually do this other thing, in my mind,
Yeah.
there's no contest. Like under threat of removing, unless there's threat of removing money, you should just always go with what the audience is going to want.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but I think that it would be quite stupid by a publisher to say different things that the audience said, but yeah.
You'd be surprised.
Okay.
there are plenty of publishers, and I shouldn't say publishers, but like there are plenty of people, individual people at publishers who will directly contradict all available feedback from the audience. And sometimes the audience is split. So it's not, and I shouldn't say like it's like the audience has a monolithic voice, like everyone has the same opinion. But yeah, there are times where it's really clear that the audience wants a certain thing or a certain set of things, and the publisher just doesn't agree, like whatever. It's very strange. Yeah, you would think that they would be sane and smart about this, but developers too. Developers sometimes can be very hard-headed. I have been very hard-headed about accepting feedback from the audience. But if you have it and it seems clear, yeah, you should just go with the audience.
Okay. So just a few days before we first met in person, I read a book, Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Jason Schreier. I actually have it here.
Nice.
It's in Russian, the Russian version. And the first chapter is dedicated to Pillars of Eternity, and you gave a lot of comments there. First of all, did you like the book? Did you read it at all?
I read our chapter, and then I skimmed through the other chapters.
Okay, so this chapter tells basically the story of this Kickstarter campaign. Would you say it's an accurate representation of what has happened?
Yeah, it's been a while. Like, so what happened is Jason Schreier, before the game went out, or before the book came out, he sent us the preview of it so we could read it, to make sure that nothing seemed like, whoa, I didn't say that, or like that's not what happened. Yeah, it seemed pretty accurate, I think. Obviously, it's hard to sort of compress all those people and all those things into one chapter of a book. And there's always going to be things that I fill in my head because I know, well, I shouldn't say I know everything. I know all the things from my perspective.
Yeah, of course.
But I also don't know. Sometimes I've seen people comment on the book and they've sort of reached conclusions that I don't think that the text really supports, but they kind of fill in the blanks because they don't know what happened. But I still do think that the description of how things happened was pretty accurate.
Okay, so this book actually has a lot of other stories about other development studios, and mainly these stories are about crunches, cancelled projects, and all in all, not that bright, to be honest. Do you think that it's good for the newcomers in the games industry to know the backside of the industry early on? Or maybe it's better to be a little bit over-enthusiastic, and this is what will lead them to success?
Well, that's the premise of what we call the American dream, which is striving against all reason and odds to succeed. It's why I thought I could be a game designer, even though the odds of me actually becoming a game designer were quite low. So to a certain extent, you have to believe in yourself, even if it doesn't seem like it's that possible. But on the other hand, this is how the industry is run. This is how things go. There's mismanagement within developers. There is interference from publishers. There's incompetence within game developers. It's not like, gamers tend to think we're about 1,000 times less competent than we actually are. But like we screw up, we make mistakes, we make sometimes very bad decisions that cost a lot of time and a lot of effort. And there's a lot of interference and a lot of weird stuff that just happens. It's game development can be very chaotic in spite of feeling somewhat structured. Yeah, I kind of feel like if you come into making games thinking that it's going to be like working in a retail store or something, like it's not. Like it's much more haphazard. Like it's just we are constantly changing our technology. That's one thing. We're constantly changing our marketplace. Like, again, digital distribution. 10 years ago, what was the penetration of broadband, and what was the split of physical versus digital distribution? 10 years ago, small games weren't really a thing, or I shouldn't say not at all, but like nowhere near they are now. So we're constantly like reconsidering how we do everything. Our engines are constantly changing. Our rendering pipelines are constantly changing, like all that stuff. So as experienced as we get and as disciplined as we try to be, we're always trying to hit a moving target. And that is a very hard thing to it's a very hard thing to achieve stability around. If you're always like, woo, like, holy crap, like now we're dealing with physically based rendering. Okay, cool. Now we're doing RTX, like we're doing real-time ray tracing. Like, okay, like we're gonna build our models and our textures and our materials like all differently now. So, or like, oh, what are our minimum specs? Like now we got to change. Like there's all this stuff that you're constantly like juggling to figure out what you're doing. Games will come out and in some way like create a evolution or a revolution within a genre that now you have to kind of like mentally, like Dark Souls. When Dark Souls came out, no one was expecting. When I first saw that game, I was like, what is this? Like when it was first announced, I had no idea what I was looking at. And from looking at how people talked about it, they also didn't understand it. And then when it came out and people played it, that was I would say that was truly a revolutionary game. And then even now, people won't shut up about Dark Souls, Demon Souls, Dark Souls. So, and now like you live in a world where you kind of have to think about like, oh, action mechanics within a role-playing game. Is it like Dark Souls? Is it like Skyrim? Is it like, what is it? What is it like? So, it's just I do think that it's important for people to understand that it is not, game development is not hell on earth, but it is a chaotic process, and there's a lot of bumps and screw ups that happen along the way. So yeah, don't lose your enthusiasm for it, but understand that it's not a easy, smooth sailing thing.
Okay, so and if you could go back in time to the beginning of your professional career, which advice would you give to yourself?
Don't write so much design documentation.
Okay.
At Black Isle Studios, we all collectively, like, we loved writing. We loved writing dialogue. We loved writing design documents. And when I actually figured it out eventually. When I was working on the Black Hound, at one point I figured out I had written 1,600 pages of design documentation.
Wow.
Like
That's a lot.
Not stuff for the game, like documentation about how to make the game. Myself, I wrote 1,600 pages
like
of that.
War and Peace.
Nobody's going to read that. And so, over time, eventually I got to this point where my own standards, and now the standards of like Obsidian, is that we try to state very clearly at the top of our doc. By the way, this is good advice for any documentation, whether it's a designer or other things, but it's very important for design, is at the top of your document say, these are the goals of this thing. Like, this is what this is supposed to accomplish, either for the player experience or for the development process. That is why you do everything in game development. You're either doing something because it's going to help make the player experience better, or it's going to make the process of making the game better. So when you state that very clearly, very simply, bullet pointed, like, this is being done so that the action combat feels fluid and smooth. And you state that as a goal. We're doing this so that the process of tagging speakers and dialogues is fast. The reason why you do that is that that's the first thing that people read. It's very short. Then you write your rest of your documentation and you keep it concise, saying this is kind of how I want this to work. What they can do is they can say, hey, if this was your goal and you're trying to do it this way, I think there's either this doesn't do the thing that you said it's going to do, or this does it, but I think there's an easier way to accomplish the thing that you want to accomplish. And that really makes the documentation a lot more concise and a lot more helpful. When you write a document that is just like 100 pages of stuff without really clearly stating what you're trying to do, one, people aren't going to read it. And two, even if they do read it, they don't know what you're trying to accomplish. So their ability to give feedback on it is hampered a lot. So over time, most of my design documents are now probably like 5 pages or less. And they just have a small number of bullet points and then like a list of stuff. And then people actually read it usually.
Yeah.
And then the engineers, usually it's engineers who will say like, well, if you want to do this, the way you're describing it, it wouldn't work that well. I'd like to do it this way instead. And then I go, yeah. And then we change the document and then they go on with it. So yeah, no documentation.
Less documentation.
And not something where it's just all word of mouth where people just talk to each other. There is a document, you can refer to it, but it's concise, it's focused on goals. That way everyone can always refer back to the goals whenever they're like, God. And you can also wind up in situations where you say you want to accomplish these two things, but they're at odds with each other. These two things don't work together. Which one do you want to emphasize, or do you want to get rid of one? And just by getting rid of a goal, immediately you can simplify many things. I'll give a short example if it's okay. On Deadfire, we had a multi-classing system. It's a class-based role-playing game. And the system that I described, and I made a video for it that's still up somewhere, where I talk about, you can every level you can pick a class, and you can have up to 3, and you can do all this stuff. And in the doc, I listed these goals. And when we went to implement it, it worked, but it wasn't good. Like it did what it was supposed to do, but it didn't really feel that good. And so one of my designers came to me and said, hey, Josh, we have these competing things. And like, if you want these two things, they each make the other thing harder. And one of them was 3 classes. It was 3 classes and the ability to advance things into classes independently, and was making everything else very complicated. All the balance was very hard. And he said, could we just drop the 3rd class, and could we drop the ability to advance them independently? And then we're left with, you have a unique class identity, and you can have 2 classes, and it's fairly balanced. And I was like, yeah. So we just removed those goals, and then we restructured it, and it was way, way, way better. We had to throw out a bunch of work, but in the end, it worked much better. It was much simpler. And just by sort of refocusing on what the goals were and getting rid of ones that weren't important, it made the whole thing a lot better.
Yeah. Okay. So stay focused on the goals. This is a good advice. Yeah. So we talked a lot about the past already. Let's talk about the present. Tell us about what you're working on right now.
I can't say much. It's not announced. Yeah, a little bit. So it's not announced yet, but I'm working on a small game. It's a small team. And we're not super far into developing it. Hopefully we'll be announcing it in the near future. But it's nice. It's been a long time since I've worked on a big project, but this is smaller than Pillars and smaller than Deadfire. So can't really say anything about it right now, but it is nice to work on a small team, because you especially during lockdown, because everyone's working remotely. And when you have a small team, it's just a lot easier to keep in touch with everyone and really understand, or hopefully understand, how people are feeling about where things stand. So, yeah.
Do you have any idea on when it's going to come out, released?
Can't say anything about it, unfortunately. Sorry.
Okay, don't worry.
Sorry.
Well, then let's talk about the further in the future.
Sure.
Do you have any global goals in games industry, and maybe where do you think the industry itself is headed?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I don't feel like I have any like really great insights into this stuff, but I do think that, more or less physical media is dead. I mean, I don't think that's like really that surprising to say that, but I think that we are probably going to see a better spread and representation of different types of games, different sizes of games, different lengths of games at a lot of different price points. Digital platforms make a lot of this stuff more viable. I do think that because this was already happening, but especially because of COVID-19, remote development and co-development, I think, is just going to become much more common. So even, what was previously sort of a crazy or a rare thing where a company like Ubisoft will have 400 people teams at a studio, and then like, and a Shanghai studio and another, and they're all working on one game.
Yeah.
Logistically, I mean, their producers must be incredible, but I think that sort of process of not just distributed development, but co-development, where you have another company that's doing co-development of entire areas or quest lines or large sections of characters, not just as a specialized like art contracting house or something, but as like, no, we're a full game developer, we work remotely, and we make a whole section of your game for you and give it to you. I think that's going to become a lot more common in game development. I already know that from my own experience that working with remote contractors, individual contractors, is just becoming a lot more common. So people all over the world, working on a team together, especially when it's small. One of the biggest success stories that I think it's crazy that people kind of overlook this is Mordhau. If people are not familiar with Mordhau, it's one of my favorite games of the last few years, and
Yeah.
it was developed entirely by, as far as I know, people who had never shipped a game before. They were modders essentially, and they're all remote. They were all remote like for years, like, and they were spread, I think, entirely through Europe, and maybe there was like somebody in Canada, but it was all like Central and Western Europe and Canadian developers working independently, and they made this incredible game that was
Yeah.
very successful. So I think that is going to become more common in game development, co-development, remote development as a team. And I do think that because of things like Game Pass, which is obviously a Microsoft thing, but I think it's really cool. With Game Pass, because it's a subscription service, you will see people who are playing games that they wouldn't normally play. Like, we as developers kind of have this expectation based on years of experience where we think of our players as being very genre focused. Because if you're like, I play role-playing games, if I see a game that might be kind of interesting, but I'm not sure, and it's not really a genre I play in, am I going to spend $50 on that? Probably not.
No.
If I see a game that's like $10 or $15, or if I'm subscribed to Game Pass and it's free, I have time, like I'll play it. And like, if I get hooked on it, then wow, like really cool. Now I'm like into this other genre, or I'm at least into this game. So I think that we're going to see people, we're already seeing people that are sort of experimenting with other genres that normally they just would strictly not play in, just because it's available to them. I do think that one of the successes of Grounded, which was Obsidian survival game that came out earlier this year, one, it came out during lockdown, which helped, and it came out on Game Pass. And I know there are a lot of people that played it that were like, I'm not really a survival game person, but I like the aesthetic, the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids aesthetic. And they played it and they're like, wow, this is really cool. Like, I didn't really think I was going to be into survival games, but cool. So I think that is probably going to be much more common now, is that people having a buffet approach to gaming, rather than just like, I only play competitive shooters, I only play RPGs, I only play RTSs or whatever.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So maybe let's get to the questions from the audience at this point. Since we have an online talk, I decided to collect some questions in advance. I've shared a link on Facebook. Maybe some of you have seen it, and everyone could send their questions. So let's get to them, and I will read them. The first one is actually not even a question. It's like a little letter, but it's super cute, so I want to read it entirely. It's from Ilya. I have been a fan of D&D games since childhood. When we were about 12, 13 years old, we've been playing Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and Neverwinter Nights for days without standing up. I understand that all these games possibly were created for folks a little older than I was. Anyway, I'm now 31. Some fans might be 40 and 50 and more. One of our junior colleagues asked me once, Baldur's Gate, is it something like a Dragon Age clone? Oh, I feel old since then. So the question is, how do you work with such different audience? Do you have any approach for young people who are really afraid of games which look so brand new and released like third part of something really ancient which you may understand? Okay, so who's the Baldur's Gate 3 for?
That's a good question. I mean, that's actually something that I thought about a lot with Pillars and Deadfire. One of our big challenges with Deadfire, like Pillars 1 did sell, it reviewed very well and it sold very well, which isn't to say that there weren't problems with it. And we tried to address those problems in Deadfire. Deadfire reviewed very well, did not sell very well. And there's a lot of questions about like, why did that happen? Was it marketing? Was it that the game just sucked actually? Was it that people bought and said that they liked Pillars 1, but actually they didn't like it? Or like there's the silent majority that really didn't like it and didn't want the second game? There's all sorts of things you can propose about it. But I do think that one thing I do think about is that and there's a counterexample to this, which is Pathfinder Kingmaker, but real time with pause games, just in general, are not as common now as they used to be. But that's what the Infinity Engine games were. The Infinity Engine games were remarkable at that time because they were real time with pause. Role-playing games prior to that were almost entirely turn-based. But that was also the late 90s, early 2000s when real-time strategy games were very common and popular on PC. And PC gaming was, well, console gaming was not quite as pronounced. So I do think that, when it comes to the types of games that I've made, especially ones that are intentionally sort of retro throwback games, there's a danger of making something that's so retro and throwback that a younger audience who's not familiar with real-time with pause, because a lot of people who tried to play Pillars or Deadfire were just like, I've never played a real-time with pause game. I can't do this. It's too hard. It's too complicated. But that's what those games were. So if you don't make it real-time with pause, then the audience that enjoyed those games might be upset because you're going with a different combat system. So I think it's a difficult line to walk. We did actually eventually introduce a turn-based mode to Deadfire. I should say that's almost entirely the idea and the work of Nick Carver and Brian McIntosh. But yeah, it's difficult. It is hard to like sort of think about what are the changes that you can make that will make something more appealing to a new audience, but will not alienate your core audience. And that's pretty much always a challenge. I think it's especially hard in role-playing games because role-playing games traditionally are very crunchy. They're very intense. There's a lot of reading. There's a lot of number crunching. There's a lot of like strategic character building. There's a lot of tactical combat. So there's a very high cognitive threshold for some of this stuff. So the audience is kind of like expecting something that's just going to beat the shit out of them math-wise. So depending on on who the audience is or who you're trying to reach, that can be a difficult sort of thing to do. So I think that you're in the right mind space though. Like if you're trying to think about your different audiences, that's the right thing to do. It's not one or the other. And sometimes compromising will make nobody happy. So that's the other thing you have to be careful of, is just saying, well, let's split the difference. Sometimes that will not satisfy anybody. So it's a continual struggle. I don't think I've been super successful at it. I think I've been okay at it. But yeah, that's the good mindset is to think, who are the different people in my audience? Who are the older players, the more traditional players? Who are the newer players? What are their expectations? And how do I deal with those?
Okay, thank you for your answer. We have some more questions. I will also combine it with the questions from Pine.
Sure.
There is a question from Stanislav. Thanks, Josh. It's a very interesting speech. And can I ask some personal question about your tattoos? Are they related to the games you did?
No, people can't really see my tattoos very well, but and I'm not going to take off my shirt or anything, but
no,
they're not. But yeah, I have a bunch of tattoos, and there are all sorts of different things. Like, some of them are, let's see here. Yeah, this is a poem that I really like. It's from a song that I really love. It's a song that I sang for my audition to get into the Conservatory of Music in college.
Wow.
It's called Silent Noon. This is from the History of the Catalan War by Sallust, Bellum Catalinae. And this is a section where Cato the Younger is addressing the Roman Senate. This is the labyrinth from the Homs Cathedral. in France, which was used on the cover of The Original Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. It's like they're all just personal things.
Okay.
And they don't have anything to do with games that I've worked on or anything like that. They're just things that I enjoy and like and want to remember. So, and then actually, this is my I don't know if you can see that one.
Yeah.
So that
yeah,
is
I
that.
see. This
Yeah,
is funny.
yeah. It's there was a. Do you know who Anfim was, Elena?
Who again?
Anfim. His name was Anfim. He was a 9-year-old boy in Novgorod, and he did drawings and writing lessons on pieces of birch that then fell into in the 13th century, and then they fell into peat in a bog, and they were preserved. And then they found them in the 20th century, and there are all these like drawings by this 9-year-old boy and writing lessons. And that's a drawing that he did.
Wow.
and I always thought it was there. It's funny because like kids' drawings, I feel like are always the same. Kids' drawings from the 13th century are the same as kids' drawings now. And this is a drawing of Anfim on his horse, stabbing somebody on the ground. So
oh my god, this is very cute. Yeah, thank you.
Some of them are just silly.
Guys sent that you rock in a pine. Okay. So we have more questions. Another one is from Alexei. Thank you a lot for your talk. Which lessons you learned from playing or DM and D&D games, and that helped you in your game design career?
Yeah, I mean, I still play D&D once a week, and last year I was running a game. I still find it very helpful for game design, especially in role-playing games. So the reason for that is playing and running the game, you kind of see things from both sides. So when you play a game, when you play a tabletop role-playing game, you make a character, you design their personality, their background, their hopes, their goals, their dreams, and you try to express that in the game. And you're working with the dungeon master and the other players to like make a story together. It's a collaborative experience. So when I'm designing a game, a role-playing game, I'm thinking about the player in that position where they're like, I have an idea in my head of this character. Is the game designer going to let me express who my character is? So when it comes to thinking about how I complete quests, how I navigate through dialogues, I think a lot about like, what are the different classes, the different skills, what are the different attitudes or types of characters that I want to play? Like if I'm really aggressive or I want to be a smartass and like really sassy and like say something really funny. Do I want to be a diplomat who's really refined and like I sound very intelligent? Or I want to sound really stupid. Like people love dumb dialogue options in Fallout or like Outer Worlds. So when I'm DMing and I see all the different things that the different players bring into the session, or when I'm playing and I think about all the different ways that I try to express myself and try to leverage my abilities, or when I don't feel it and I think like, what happened? Like what's going wrong here? What's not working either mechanically or story-wise? And that's what I take into designing role-playing games, is I'm trying to think about when Obsidian designs a role-playing game, we're designing a digital tabletop experience without a dungeon master. Like we're not there to like handle things on the fly. So we have to try to think of 90% of the things that players are going to want to do, what their fantasies are going to be to want to do. And so that when we hand them that game, and they get to that point, they're like, oh, cool, I got to use my science skill, or like, oh, awesome, like it recognized that I'm a dwarf and I got to like do this cool dwarf thing that no other class or no other race could do. So that's really what I think tabletop gaming, running games and playing games, does for me.
Okay, thank you. And maybe the last question, I'll take it from my questionnaire from Alexander. Hi, Josh. Please tell us about the most interesting or unusual situations that happened to you in the games industry, or not.
The most interesting or unusual situation.
Maybe what comes to your mind first.
Let's see. I will say that it is really strange to me when I get recognized by anybody. It's really strange to me when I get recognized by anybody, even at like a convention. I'm more used to it now, but I have actually been recognized by people outside of gaming conventions, which is very strange. I basically think of like, and maybe this is just a biased way of thinking, but I think of gamers as being like, gamers exist in game conventions and on computers and on the internet. So when I'm like walking around somewhere or traveling and someone just says like, hey,
I know
you're the Pillars of Eternity guy, or like you're the Fallout New Vegas guy, it's very odd for me. And I was in Styria in southeast Austria 2 years ago, I think. And I was on like a winery tour. It was like really near the border. It was like way out in the countryside, and with a bunch of other people. And we had a nice meal and some wine. And then we were getting up to leave, and our server, who was, I'm going to guess he was like 19 or 20 or something. And he just was like, it was an honor to serve you. I love Fallout New Vegas. It's my favorite game.
Oh, that's just
and it was really flattering. But like, it's always shocking to me that anybody sort of recognizes me anywhere. So that was very, very surprising for me. In terms of game development itself, I'll always tell the story about bugs are usually the funniest thing. Like the most unusual things that we encounter are always the funny bugs. I'll tell a short version of this because I know you don't got a lot of time, but in Fallout New Vegas, we had a bug where there's a group of guys called the Remnants, and they're these old timers from Fallout 2, the NCR, or not the NCR, sorry, the Enclave, and you can convince them to fight alongside you in the last battle, in the Battle of Hoover Dam, and they all show up at the end, and it's like this big dramatic thing. And there was a bug where if you fought one of these guys and killed him because he would confront you after the quest, he would still show up at the end, but he would show up dead. So you'd have this like helicopter drop down, and like one after another, everyone in the group would like jump out, and then this like mangled corpse would just like fall out of the vertibird onto the dam. And when we saw this bug, we had been crunching. I think we were doing, like 60-hour. We didn't do a lot of crunch on New Vegas, but it was like a 60-hour work week. And I want to say it was like 10 or 11 at night. So it was like pretty late. And so we were all like operating on very low sleep. And we just started laughing, and we just couldn't stop laughing. And like, it was just this room of designers like crying because we were laughing so hard at these bugs. So yeah, bugs are frustrating, but sometimes they are
funny.
Very funny. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think that we're out of time now. And thank you for the talk. Thank you for your answers. And thank you everyone for your questions.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, have a good day, Josh. And everyone have a nice evening. I know we have an online party today, so it's time to mingle.